January 1940. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. The room smelled of tobacco, damp wool, and machine oil, a peculiar blend that would become the scent of secrets for 5 years to come. In Hut 6, beneath a single overhead bulb that swung slightly from the heating vent, mathematician Gordon Welshman stared at a strip of paper emerging from the bomba machine. The metal drums clicked in rhythmic sequence, 48 hours of continuous operation. 23 failed attempts. The strip curled into his palm, like a confession. His hand did not shake. Not yet. The Enigma machine had been Germany's voice since 1933, rotating rotors, plugboard permutations, millions of possible combinations reset daily at midnight. Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, Luftwaffe, all spoke through it. And until this moment, all had spoken in silence. The intercepts arrived daily from listening stations across Britain, garbled strings of letters that held convoy routes, battle orders, invasion timelines, unintelligible, maddening. A language of ghosts, but this strip was different. Welshman read the decrypted line 3 times. Weather report, routine, banal, a single sentence about wind speed over the North Sea, transmitted that morning by a German meteorological station. The kind of message that meant nothing to a war. The kind of message that meant everything to a mind, because it was real. He walked across the hut, 7 steps, and placed the paper on the desk of Dilly Knox, the veteran cryptanalyst who had broken Italian naval codes in the Great War. Knox lifted it, read, set it down, looked at Welshman without expression. Neither man spoke for 11 seconds. Somewhere beyond the blackout curtains, an owl called twice. Knox finally said, "Do it again." They did. By dawn, 3 more messages. All meteorological, all trivial, all confirmed through cross-referenced call signs and transmission patterns. The machine had not guessed. It had understood. The rotor settings for January 17, 1940, recovered through mathematical assault and Polish ingenuity, had turned cipher into language. Enigma had spoken back, and what it said was terrifying, not because of content, but because of implication. Extract from Welshman's internal memo, January 18th. We are reading their morning prayers. They do not know we are in the room. The initial reaction was not celebration. It was vertigo. Alistair Denniston, the operational head of Bletchley Park, was summoned at 0600 hours. He arrived in a threadbare overcoat, his breath visible in the unheated hut. He read the decrypts. He asked one question: how long until they changed the system? No one answered, because no one knew. The entire German military used Enigma variants. If this breach held, the Allies would know troop movements before field officers did, U-boat coordinates before the torpedoes loaded, Luftwaffe bombing targets before the crews briefed. They would know everything. Or they would know until the enemy realized the lock had been picked, and changed it. That was the fear beneath the triumph. Not the cracking itself, but the clock it started. Every decrypt was evidence. Every intercept acted upon was a risk. Use the intelligence too obviously, and Germany would suspect. Ignore it, and soldiers died needlessly. The line between advantage and exposure was invisible, subjective, and measured in lives. By midday, 14 personnel had been read into the breakthrough. They were instructed to refer to decrypted intelligence only as Boniface, a fictional agent, a cover story for a source that did not exist. The intercepts themselves would be classified ULTRA, above top secret, compartmentalized even within the intelligence community. Churchill would be briefed within 48 hours. Roosevelt, later. Stalin, never. The implications branched like frost across glass. Tactical, strategic, moral. Welshman, January 20th, 1940. London. The briefing room in the Admiralty building had no windows. 16 chairs. A single map of the Atlantic pinned to cork board, convoy routes marked in red grease pencil. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, arrived 9 minutes early, unusual for a man who governed by theatrical lateness. He sat. He did not remove his coat. The folder placed before him was marked with a diagonal stripe, ULTRA classification, introduced 72 hours prior. He read for 4 minutes without speaking. What the folder contained was not intelligence in the traditional sense. It was prescience. German naval movements decoded in real time. U-boat Wolfpack coordinates transmitted at dawn, decrypted by noon. Weather patterns the Luftwaffe would use to time raids. supply convoy schedules, officer communications that revealed not just plans but doubt, fatigue, optimism. The Enigma breakthrough had turned the war from a fog into a glass house. But glass cuts when it breaks. Churchill looked up. How reliable. His voice carried the gravel of too many cigars and too little sleep. Stuart Menzies, chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, answered, mathematically certain, operationally unproven. Silence. The room understood the distinction. A decrypt could be perfect and still lead to disaster if acted upon carelessly. If a U-boat transmitted its position and the Royal Navy appeared within the hour, Berlin would notice. If Luftwaffe bombing coordinates were intercepted and RAF fighters waited in exact formation at the exact location, the pattern would emerge. Enigma's strength was Germany's faith in its invincibility. Break that faith, and the machine would evolve, the rotors would multiply, the advantage would vanish. Churchill leaned back. So we can see them, but we cannot look directly at them. Correct. Menzies outlined the framework already taking shape at Bletchley Park. Intelligence would be filtered through invented sources, fictional reconnaissance flights, imaginary coast watchers, plausible accidents. Every intercept would require a cover story before action. Naval engagements would be delayed by hours to allow routine patrol, explanations. Bomber targets would be discovered through dummy radar reports. The Allies would have to pretend to be lucky, consistently, for years. And some intelligence would have to be ignored entirely. The ethical equation was immediate and ugly. If a convoy route was known but acting on it would expose the source, how many ships could be sacrificed to protect the secret? If a bombing raid was decoded but scrambling fighters seemed too precise, how many civilians died in the name of long-term advantage? The intercepts gave knowledge. They did not give permission. Extract from Menzies' directive, January 22, 1940, U-Ultra material will not justify action unless alternative explanation exists. Operational commanders will not be informed of source. Cover will precede consequence. The order created a shadow war within the war, one fought not against the enemy but against the appearance of knowing too much. Intelligence officers at Bletchley Park would decode life and death information and then watch it filed, delayed, or discarded based on strategic calculus 3 levels removed from the battlefield. They would know the bomb was coming, they would know the convoy was doomed, and they would remain silent until a lie could be constructed to justify the response. It was a kind of omniscience that felt more like complicity. By February, the system crystallized into protocol. U-Ultra decrypts were hand-delivered by courier to a list of fewer than 30 individuals. Churchill received daily summaries, typed on salmon-colored paper to distinguish them from standard intelligence. Field commanders received sanitized intelligence, the conclusion without the source, the warning without the method. Entire operations were designed backward, decide the outcome, then invent the plausible path to discovery. The psychological cost was not recorded in official documents, but the letters remain. A young analyst named Margaret Turing wrote to her brother Alan, the mathematician whose theoretical work had enabled the bomber machines, "We are becoming very good liars. I wonder if that is the same as becoming wise." No one celebrated. The breakthrough was operational, not victorious. Every decrypt was a small treason against chance, a theft from the enemy's presumed privacy. And every theft increased the risk of detection. The Germans were not fools. They would notice patterns, they would investigate losses, they would question their own security. The war had not changed, but the rules of engagement had become invisible. Menzies left the Admiralty that evening and walked along the Thames. The river was black, the city darkened by blackout regulations. Somewhere across that water, German operators were typing messages into Enigma machines, confident in their impregnability, and in a frozen hut in Buckinghamshire, those messages were being read like morning mail. The advantage was real, the burden was unbearable. April 9, 1940. Norwegian coast. The decrypt arrived at 0342 hours. Bletchley Park, Hut 6. Operation Weserübung. The word meant nothing in English, but the coordinates were unambiguous. German naval forces moving toward Narvik, Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, 6 cities. Simultaneous invasion. Launch time, dawn. The Enigma traffic had been building for 72 hours. transport schedules, supply manifests, artillery placement. But this was the operational order, signed by Admiral Raeder himself, transmitted fleet-wide, decoded in 23 minutes. Britain had 6 hours warning that Norway would fall. The decrypt went by motorcycle courier to the Admiralty. By 0510, the War Cabinet was convened. Maps unfurled, options listed. The Royal Navy had surface ships within striking range, destroyers, cruisers, submarines positioned for North Atlantic patrol. If they moved immediately, if they intercepted at the fjord mouths, the German transports would be vulnerable. Troop ships, landing craft. The entire northern invasion could collapse before the first soldier reached shore, but there was no plausible explanation for why British ships would be there. No reconnaissance flight had been scheduled, no coast watcher had reported activity, no routine patrol intersected those coordinates. If the Royal Navy appeared in force at the exact moment of the German operation, Berlin would know, they would investigate, they would question the machine, and Ultra, 3 months old, still fragile, still the only window into enemy planning, would die. The room understood this. No one said it aloud. Extract from Admiral Pound's handwritten note, April 9th, "We can see the knife, we cannot catch the hand." The decision was made by 0600 hours. The Navy would respond, but slowly. Reconnaissance flights would be coincidentally routed over the Norwegian coast at 0900. Destroyers would be repositioned under the cover of routine patrol adjustments. By the time British forces arrived in strength, the German invasion would be underway, visible, explainable. The response would look reactive, not prescient. Norway would fall, but Ultra would survive. At Bletchley Park, the analysts who had decoded the operation received no feedback. They did not know if their intelligence had been used. They did not know it had been deliberately delayed. They returned to their machines, their worksheets, their next intercept. The drums rotated, the letters emerged. Somewhere in the distance, soldiers were landing on a hostile shore. By noon, Oslo had been taken. Narvik followed. The Norwegian government fled to London, the king to exile. The campaign would drag on for 2 months. Brutal, chaotic, ultimately futile. British and French forces would arrive, fight, and retreat. Germany would secure the entire coastline. Hitler would call it a triumph of speed and daring. The intelligence community called it something else. The first operational sacrifice. The term never appeared in official records, but within the Ultra network, it became shorthand for the calculus that now governed every decrypt. Some intelligence could be used, some had to be watched, documented and buried. The distinction was not moral, it was mathematical. How many lives today versus how many operations tomorrow? How much loss now to preserve the advantage later? The analysts felt it first. Joan Clark, working in Hut 8 on Naval Enigma, wrote in her diary on April 12, "We solve the puzzle, and then we watch the consequences arrive like trains on a schedule we wrote but cannot alter." The psychological fracture was subtle but cumulative. They were not soldiers, they were not commanders, they were cryptanalysts, mathematicians, linguists, people trained to solve problems, not to weigh lives. Yet every decrypt carried an implicit question, what will be done with this? And increasingly, the answer was nothing, or not enough, or too late to matter. The tension was compounded by isolation. Ultra personnel could not discuss their work with family, with friends, with anyone outside the cleared list. They could not explain why they seemed exhausted by tasks that looked clerical. They could not mention the names they saw in the decrypts, the U-boat captains, the Luftwaffe squadron leaders, the Wehrmacht colonels, whose communications they read like personal mail. They knew these men, not personally, but intimately. They knew their concerns, their habits, their fears. They knew which commanders were cautious and which were reckless. They knew who complained about supply shortages and who boasted about kill counts. The Enigma decrypts were not abstract data. They were human voices, transmitted in confidence, intercepted in secret, and read by strangers who would use that knowledge to kill them. It felt, at times, like eavesdropping on a confession before an execution. By May, the operational doctrine had hardened. A formal system, 3-tier prioritization. Category 1 intelligence could be acted upon immediately, if adequate cover existed. Category 2 required consultation with theater commanders and approval from Menzies' office. Category 3 would be logged, archived, and used only for long-term strategic planning, never for immediate action. Most decrypts were Category 3. The Norwegian invasion had established the precedent. Ultra was too valuable to risk on single engagements. It would be hoarded, rationed, deployed only when the operational gain outweighed the exposure risk. This meant watching, waiting, knowing, and sometimes doing nothing. The analysts did not protest. They were not asked to. But the silence in Hut 6 changed texture, less conversation, more smoking. The sound of the bomber machines became a kind of white noise, constant, mechanical, indifferent. The decrypts kept coming, the war kept moving, and somewhere in the gap between knowledge and action, something invisible began to accumulate. November 14, 1940. Coventry. The decrypt arrived at 1500 hours. Luftwaffe operational order, transmitted from Kesselring's headquarters. Target designation, Korn. The code name meant nothing to the radio operator at Station X who logged it. But by 1530, the cross-reference was complete. Korn was Coventry, a Midlands industrial city, population 200,000, home to aircraft engine factories, munitions works, and a medieval cathedral that had stood for 600 years. The raid was scheduled for 1900 hours, moonlight bombing, full payload, 400 aircraft. The intelligence reached Churchill's desk by 1600. 60 minutes of daylight remained. The memo was clear: large-scale incendiary attack, concentrated on industrial center, expected duration 5 to 7 hours. Casualty estimates catastrophic. The Luftwaffe had been testing this tactic for weeks, massed bomber formations using X-Gerate radio beam guidance for precision targeting. Coventry had been selected, not for strategic value alone, but for psychological impact. A city, not a port, not a base, a place where people lived. The decision matrix was immediate and binary. Option 1, alert the city. Sound the sirens early. Evacuate what could be evacuated. Scramble RAF night fighters in force. Position anti-aircraft batteries along the approach vectors. Use the 4 hours of warning to minimize casualties. The city would know something was wrong. The response would save lives. And Berlin would ask how Britain knew. Option 2, let it happen. Extract from Cabinet War Room minutes. November 14, 1940, 1615 hours. Discussion held regarding source protection versus civilian exposure. No formal vote recorded. The silence in that line is louder than the words. Churchill walked to the window, Whitehall below. Early blackout settling over London. Somewhere northwest, Coventry was preparing for an ordinary evening, factories running second shift, families sitting for supper, the cathedral bell ringing 6 o'clock. None of them knew. The intelligence existed in a room 15 miles from the target, held by 11 people, and useless, because to use it was to lose it. The logic was sound, cold, but sound. If RAF fighters appeared in unusual numbers at the exact intercept point, if anti-aircraft fire began before the bombers arrived, if the evacuation seemed preemptive rather than reactive, the Luftwaffe would investigate. They would question the beam guidance system. They would interview captured aircrews. They would examine their own communications security. And eventually, inevitably, they would reach the Enigma machine. U-Ultra had been operational for 10 months. In that time it had provided intelligence on U-boat positions that saved 37 convoys. It had revealed Luftwaffe sortie plans that allowed RAF ambushes over the Channel. It had exposed German supply shortages that informed strategic bombing target selection. The cumulative value was incalculable. The future value, if the war lasted years as it would, was potentially decisive. Against that one city, one night, Churchill did not make the decision alone, but he made it final. The order went to RAF Fighter Command at 1645, maintain standard patrol rotations. Do not concentrate forces over Coventry. Engage only if bombers are visually acquired by routine sectors. To regional civil defense, rely on existing spotter network. Sound sirens upon aircraft detection. No advance warning authorized. To fire brigades, pre-position equipment within standard protocols. No extraordinary measures. Coventry would face the raid as if it were a surprise. At Bletchley Park, the analysts who had decrypted the Korn order were not informed of the decision. They continued working. By 1800, additional intercepts confirmed bomber group assembly points, refueling schedules, and return routes. The intelligence was catalogued, filed, marked Category 3, not for immediate action. At 1910 hours, the first Pathfinder aircraft dropped magnesium flares over Coventry. The X-ray beams guided the formations with precision. The sirens wailed 11 minutes late, after the first bombs fell. The city had no meaningful warning. The RAF engaged, but piecemeal, reactive. 13 bombers were shot down. 387 reached the target. The raid lasted 11 hours. 568 people died. Thousands were injured. The city centre was obliterated. 12 aircraft factories sustained damage, but none were destroyed. The Luftwaffe's aim was scattered by smoke and fire. The medieval cathedral burned. Its roof collapsed inward at 0300, the timber beams glowing like a skeleton. Photographers captured the image, stone walls standing, interior consumed, the altar visible through the absent ceiling. The photograph would become iconic, a symbol of resilience, of endurance. No one mentioned the decrypt. By dawn, the fires were still burning. Rescue teams dug through rubble. Survivors wandered streets they no longer recognized. The official report called it a successful civil defense response under difficult conditions. Churchill visited 3 days later. He walked through the ruins. He did not speak to the press. A witness recorded that he wept briefly, once, before returning to the car. The intelligence community did not discuss Coventry openly. There was no formal review, no memorandum explaining the decision, but within the ULTRA network, the event became a reference point, a boundary, the moment when the abstract calculus of source protection became visceral. Because everyone understood now, the decrypts were not just intelligence, they were foreknowledge, and foreknowledge without action was a kind of participation. Alan Turing's assistant, Peter Hilton, wrote years later, we knew with absolute certainty, and we filed the paper and went to the canteen for tea. I remember thinking this is what damnation feels like. Others rationalized. The raid would have happened regardless. The warning would have been insufficient. The casualties were tragic but militarily inevitable. Ultra's survival meant future raids could be countered, invasions anticipated, the war shortened, 1 night against 3 years, 500 deaths against millions saved. The arithmetic was sound, but arithmetic does not account for the sound of a city burning while you hold the match. December 1940, May 1943, Bletchley Park. The work continued. It had to. By January 1941, Bletchley Park employed over 1,500 personnel. The huts expanded. New bomber machines arrived monthly, faster, more sophisticated, capable of testing rotor configurations in minutes rather than hours. Naval Enigma fell in pieces, the Kriegsmarine's officer variant in February, the U-boat network in May. Luftwaffe keys rotated daily but remained readable. Wehrmacht traffic became routine. The Allies were reading German military communications faster than some German commanders received them. ULTRA became industrial, systematic, a factory of secrets. But factories require workers, and workers remember. The psychological cost had no formal measurement. There were no counselors, no debriefings, no protocols for processing what it meant to know death was coming, and remain silent. The Official Secrets Act forbade discussion outside cleared channels. Inside those channels, silence was operational doctrine. The analysts learned not to ask what happened to their intelligence. They decoded, they transcribed, they passed the intercepts forward. The chain of consequence disappeared beyond their sight, except when it didn't. Mavis Beatty, a cryptanalyst in the Italian section, later described the peculiar intimacy of the work. You learned their rhythms, the careless ones who reused phrases, the nervous ones who triple-checked coordinates. You began to recognize operators by their keystroke patterns like handwriting, and then one day their call signs simply stopped appearing. You knew what that meant. They knew the U-boat commanders by name before those names appeared in casualty lists. They knew which Luftwaffe pilots flew aggressively, and which conservatively. They knew the Wehrmacht officers who questioned orders, and the ones who obeyed without hesitation. The intercepts were not data. They were portraits, and the portraits accumulated. By mid-1941, the operational protocol was entrenched. ULTRA intelligence would be used selectively, strategically, and always with cover. Convoy routes were adjusted based on reconnaissance reports. U-boats were depth-charged after routine patrols detected periscope wakes. Luftwaffe raids were intercepted by alert coastal observers. The lies were plausible. The Germans believed them. The system functioned, but the human cost was not in the lying. It was in the listening, because Enigma was not only tactical, it was personal. The machine transmitted weather complaints, supply shortages, requests for leave, arguments between officers, reports of illness, exhaustion, frostbite, fear. The German military communicated through Enigma as if it were private, because they believed it was. And Bletchley Park read every word. They read the message from a U-boat captain asking if his son's birthday package had arrived. They read the Luftwaffe pilot reporting recurring nightmares. They read the Wehrmacht colonel requesting reassignment after his entire unit was killed in a bombing raid. Then they passed that intelligence forward. And days later, those voices stopped. Joan Clark kept a private list, not officially, not systematically, just a small notebook where she recorded call signs that disappeared. Years later, when asked why, she said simply, someone had to remember they were people. The moral ambiguity was cumulative. Every intercept was a choice someone else made downstream, but the analysts lived upstream. They provided the knowledge, they enabled the decisions, and they could not unsee what they had seen, or unknow what they had known. In April 1942, a young translator named Sarah Norton intercepted a German message from North Africa. A medical officer requesting emergency blood supplies for a field hospital, coordinates included. She decoded it in 14 minutes. Flagged it as Category 2 intelligence, actionable target. The field hospital was bombed 3 days later. 73 casualties, including patients. The after-action report noted successful strike on enemy logistics hub. Norton requested transfer to non-operational duties. Denied. Shortage of qualified German linguists. She remained at her post for 2 more years. The breaking point was different for everyone. Some compartmentalized cleanly. The work was abstract, the consequences were distant, the enemy had started the war. Others rationalized through necessity. This intelligence saved Allied lives, shortened campaigns, prevented worse outcomes. A few quietly unraveled. There were no formal psychiatric evaluations. Personnel who showed signs of distress were reassigned to administrative roles or released from duty under vague medical pretexts. No one spoke the word trauma. The term did not yet exist in this context. But the symptoms were recognizable: insomnia, hypervigilance, emotional flatness, obsessive rechecking of work. Some analysts began making deliberate errors, small ones, correctable ones, errors that would delay a decrypt by hours, but not invalidate it. A form of unconscious sabotage. A way to create distance between the work and the consequence. It was noticed, not punished, but noted. Extract from Personnel Evaluation, August 1942, name redacted, subject displays exceptional technical proficiency, but shows signs of moral fatigue. Recommend rotation to training duties, if replacement available. Replacement not available. By 1943, ULTRA had become the Allies' most valuable intelligence asset. It informed the North Africa campaign. It exposed Rommel's supply vulnerabilities. It enabled the destruction of Axis convoys in the Mediterranean. It provided Allied planners with German assessments of their own weaknesses, a kind of strategic mirror. The war was turning. ULTRA was credited, quietly, with shortening the conflict by an estimated 2 years. 2 years. Millions of lives. The arithmetic justified everything. But arithmetic does not sleep at night. Peter Hilton, who worked directly with Alan Turing on bomba machine refinements, later wrote, "We were not monsters, we were not heroes. We were people who had been given a tool and told that using it required watching others die, and we used it. Because the alternative was worse. We believed that, we had to." The tension was never resolved, it was managed through routine, through humor, through the small mercies of bureaucratic distance. The analysts did not see the bombed cities, they did not attend the funerals, they did not hear the screams. They saw letters on paper, numbers on worksheets, sequences of rotors and plugboard settings. The intellectual puzzle remained pure. The moral consequence remained invisible. Except when it didn't. Except when someone remembered that the call sign they had been tracking for 6 months belonged to a real submarine with a real crew. Except when the intercept they decoded mentioned a soldier's name, and that name later appeared in a captured document listing the dead. except when they realized they had been reading the last words of May 8, 1945. Bletchley Park. The war ended on a Tuesday. Victory in Europe was announced at 1500 hours. Churchill's voice came through the radio in Hut 6, triumphant, exhausted, defiant. Across Britain, people poured into the streets. Bells rang, flags unfurled, strangers embraced. The grief and relief and disbelief of survival compressed into a single luminous afternoon. 6 years of darkness, done. At Bletchley Park, the analysts turned off the bomba machines. The silence was immediate and total. No more rotating drums, no more clicking relays, no more strips of paper curling out with decrypted text. The Enigma network had gone quiet days earlier as German command structures collapsed, but the machines had kept running, testing, verifying, searching for final transmissions. Now there was nothing left to decode. Someone opened a bottle of champagne. It was warm. No one cared. They drank from tea mugs and chipped glasses. They stood in small clusters, speaking softly, as if the habit of secrecy had woven itself into their voices permanently. A few wept. Most did not. The emotional release they had expected, the catharsis, the justification, the sense of completion did not arrive. Instead, there was only a peculiar emptiness. The work that had consumed them, defined them, isolated them from the world was simply over, and they were not permitted to explain what they had done. Extract from Final Staff Briefing, May 9, 1945. All personnel are reminded that obligations under the Official Secrets Act remain in force indefinitely. Discussion of methods, sources, or outcomes is prohibited. Violations will be prosecuted. They dispersed. Back to universities. Back to civilian jobs. Back to families who asked what they had done during the war and received vague answers about clerical work or administration. The bomber machines were dismantled. The intercepts were archived under lock. The huts were emptied. Within months, Bletchley Park returned to administrative obscurity, its wartime function erased from public record. The analysts carried the knowledge alone. For Joan Clark, it meant returning to Cambridge and resuming research in numismatics, ancient coins, dead empires, civilizations that could no longer be harmed by knowledge. She never spoke publicly about Yulcha. When asked in later years about her war service, she would smile and say she had helped with